Around the World Lit Audio. The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Part 1. Chapters 1-3. Full narration script. Channel intro. Welcome to Around the World Lit Audio, the greatest novels ever written, from every corner of the world, in English. New chapter every week, free to listen. Book introduction. Today we begin our fourth book, The Master and Margarita, by Mikhail Bulgakov. Written in secret in the Soviet Union during the 1930s, hidden from Stalin's censors, revised obsessively for over 12 years, and never published in Bulgakov's lifetime. He died in 1940. The novel was not published until 1967, 27 years after his death. Before we begin, you should know the story of how this book came to exist, because it is as remarkable as anything inside it. Bulgakov began writing The Master and Margarita in 1928. By 1930, terrified of what would happen if the Soviet authorities found it, he burned the manuscript. Burned it himself, with his own hands, in his own fireplace. Then, 2 years later, he began again. He could not stop. The novel would not leave him. He said, toward the end of his life, that he wrote it because he had to, that it was the only thing he had left to give. He dictated the final revisions to his wife Yelena from his deathbed, barely able to speak, his eyesight failing from the kidney disease that was killing him. His last words to her about the manuscript were, "So that they know. So that they know. They know now." The Master and Margarita has been translated into 67 languages. It has inspired films, operas, ballets, and one of the most famous rock songs ever written, the Rolling Stones' Sympathy for the Devil, which opens with the line, "Please allow me to introduce myself. I'm a man of wealth and taste." That man is Walland, the devil, the central figure of this novel. This is a book about the devil visiting Soviet Moscow, about Pontius Pilate and Jesus, about a writer who burns his masterpiece, and the woman who loves him, about courage and cowardice, about what it costs to tell the truth in a world that punishes truth-telling. It is funny. It is terrifying. It is one of the most extraordinary novels ever written. And it begins, as the best things often do, with a stranger at a park bench. Part 1. Chapter 1. Part 1. Chapter 1. Never talk to strangers. One spring evening, at the hour of an unusually hot sunset, two citizens appeared at Patriarch's pawns in Moscow. The first was Mikhail Alexandrovich Berlioz, a plump, well-fed man of about 40, with dark hair and wearing a neat summer suit. He was the editor of a thick literary journal, and the chairman of the board of one of Moscow's largest literary organizations, called Massalet. He was, in every outward respect, a man of importance. The second was the poet Ivan Nikolaevich Ponarev, who wrote under the pen name Homeless. He was young, perhaps 24, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with the particular intensity of a young man who has recently discovered that he has opinions and enjoys having them. They had come to the park to talk about a poem. Berlioz had commissioned it and was not satisfied. The poem was about Jesus Christ. Specifically, it was meant to argue that Jesus Christ had never existed. Berlioz felt that the poet had made Jesus too vivid, too real, too much like a person. A man who had never existed should not feel present on the page. He should feel like an absence, a myth, a convenient fiction invented by the credulous. Homeless had given him a man who breathed. They sat by the pond and Berlioz explained his objections carefully, as editors do. The evening was warm and the linden trees smelled of blossom and the water was still, and the whole scene had the pleasant, unremarkable quality of a Moscow evening in May. Then something unremarkable became remarkable. Berlioz saw, at the edge of his vision, something that should not have been there. A figure, not a person exactly, but a transparency in the shape of a person, wavering slightly in the heat of the evening air. It was there, and then it was not, and he told himself it was a trick of the light and turned back to Homeless. But the feeling of it remained. Before they could continue their conversation, the figure materialized into a real man, or rather, into something that presented itself as a real man with such persuasiveness, that for all practical purposes it was one. He was tall, extraordinarily tall, and thin, and dressed in an expensive gray suit, with expensive gray shoes, and carrying a walking stick with a black knob, in the shape of a poodle's head. His face was interesting in the way that a knife is interesting, clean and precise and capable of harm. One of his eyes was green, the other was black and entirely still. His eyebrows were black and one sat higher than the other, which gave him a permanently quizzical expression, as though he had just asked a question that no one had yet answered. He sat down on the bench beside them without being invited, and with the comfortable manner of a man who does not consider it possible that his presence might be unwelcome. He had been listening to their conversation, he said. He hoped they would forgive him. He was a foreigner, a professor, a specialist in black magic, he added, as though this were an ordinary academic specialty, like comparative literature or medieval history, and he was very interested in the question they were discussing, the question of whether Jesus Christ had ever existed. Both men regarded him with the caution that Soviet citizens of the 1930s reserved for unexpected strangers, who inserted themselves into conversations about religion. This caution was not spiritual, it was practical. Conversations about religion were the kind of conversations that could go badly. The foreigner seemed unaware of this caution, or indifferent to it. He asked Berlioz whether he truly did not believe in God. Berlioz said that he did not. The foreigner seemed delighted. He said, "How wonderful." He said that the question of God's existence was, in his experience, quite settled. And then he said something that stopped the conversation entirely. He said that he had recently been having breakfast with Immanuel Kant. They had discussed the fifth proof of God's existence, Kant's own proof, and the foreigner had suggested a few improvements. Kant had been receptive. Berlioz and Homeless looked at each other. The foreigner looked at them, both with the expression of a man who has said something he considers completely reasonable and is mildly curious why it has caused difficulty. He then asked Berlioz, "If there is no God," he said, "then who, may I ask, governs human life? Who is in charge of all of this?" He waved his hand at the park, the pond, the city beyond it, the evening sky. Berlioz said, "Man governs it himself." The foreigner said, "I beg your pardon." He smiled. Man governed himself. He said this with a tone of such genuine and delighted incredulity that Berlioz felt, for just a moment, genuinely uncertain. Then the foreigner asked Berlioz a question, a very specific question. He asked, "Where will you be this evening?" Berlioz said, "At a meeting." The foreigner shook his head. He said, "No." He said that this evening, Berlioz would have his head cut off by a Russian woman, a member of the Komsomol, who drives a tram. Berlioz stared at him. The foreigner looked back pleasantly, as though he had commented on the weather. Before anyone could respond, the foreigner said, "Now, permit me to tell you a story about Pontius Pilate. He was there, you see. He saw it all, and he would very much like to give you the correct account. He had been there. He had seen it all. And so, at Patriarch's Ponds in Moscow, on a warm May evening, with the linden trees in blossom and the tram lines humming in the distance, the devil, for that is who he was, began to tell the story of the death of Jesus Christ." Part 1, Chapter 2. Pontius Pilate. The white cloak with the blood-red lining. That is the first thing Pontius Pilate saw when they brought the prisoner in. Not the man himself. His headache was too severe for that. A headache of the kind that splits the world cleanly into the part that exists and the part that is too bright to look at. He saw the cloak first, and then, slowly, through the pain, he assembled the rest. The man was young, perhaps 27. His hands were tied behind him. He had been beaten, not severely, but enough. His face was calm in a way that made Pilate uneasy, because it was not the calm of resignation or stupidity but the calm of a man who has genuinely nothing to fear, which is the most unsettling kind. His name was Yeshua HaNazri. He had been brought before the procurator on a charge of inciting the people of Yerushalayim to destroy the temple of the Lord. Pilate asked the prisoner if he had said these things. The prisoner said, "Good man, I never said." Pilate interrupted him. He said, "I am not a good man. I am the procurator of Judea. You will address me as Hegemon." The prisoner looked at him. Then he said, "Very well, Hegemon. I never said that the temple should be destroyed. What I said was that the temple of the old faith would collapse, and a new temple of truth would be built. I said this by way of metaphor." Pilate looked at him for a long moment. The prisoner's eyes were calm and direct and held in them something that Pilate recognized and disliked, the quality of a man who tells the truth because he has genuinely never found a reason not to. Pilate had a sharp mind and many years of experience reading people, and he recognized immediately that this prisoner was not a revolutionary, not an agitator, not a man with a political program. He was a wandering philosopher of the kind that appeared occasionally in the East, a man who went from town to town with a small group of followers saying things that were impractical, and luminous and easily misunderstood. He had said something about truth and about a new temple, and someone, a man named Matthew Levi, a tax collector, who had recently taken to following the prisoner around with a piece of goat skin and writing things down, had written it down incorrectly. This happened constantly with wandering philosophers. People heard what they needed to hear rather than what was said. Pilate was inclined to release him. He saw no crime. The charge was thin. The man was harmless. But then the prisoner said something that changed everything. He said, "Among the things I have said, Hegemon, there is one thing I said about power. I said that all power is a form of violence over people, and that the time will come when there will be no power of Caesar or any other power. Man will enter the kingdom of truth and justice, where no such power will be needed." Pilate's secretary stopped writing. In the courtyard below, where the crowd had gathered and the heat was already rising off the stones, everything was still. Pilate said, Is that what you believe? The prisoner said, yes. Pilate closed his eyes for a moment. His headache was very bad. The sun was brutal. The smell of roses from somewhere, he hated the smell of roses, filled the air. He knew what he had to do. He knew what the high priest Caiaphas would say. He knew what Rome would say. He knew that releasing a man who had spoken against the power of Caesar was not something a procurator of Judea could do and remain a procurator of Judea. He did not want to do it. For a long moment, Pontius Pilate, the most powerful man in Judea, a man who had ordered the deaths of dozens, without losing a night's sleep, sat on his throne in the burning morning sun, and felt something that he had not felt in years. He felt afraid, not of the prisoner, of himself, of the thing he was about to do, which he already knew he would do, and which he already knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to undo, unsuccessfully, forever. He ordered the prisoner taken away. He called for Caiaphas. He told him, I find no guilt in this man. Caiaphas said, the law is the law. Pilate said, I will release him for Passover. I exercise my right. Caiaphas said, release Bar Reuben instead. Pilate looked at Caiaphas for a long time. Then he called for water and washed his hands. The crowd cheered for Bar Reuben. Yeshua ha-Nazri was led away to be crucified. And Pontius Pilate, the man who had washed his hands of the whole thing, sat alone in his palace with his headache, and the smell of roses and the knowledge that he had just committed the greatest act of cowardice in the history of the world. He would not be forgiven for it. Not by the world. Not by himself. Not for 2,000 years. Part 1, Chapter 3, The Seventh Proof. Back at Patriarch's Pons, the foreigner had finished his story. Berlioz and Homeless sat in silence for a moment, absorbing it. The story had been told with such precision and detail, the smell of the rose oil, the heat of the Jerusalem sun, the specific quality of Pilate's headache, that both men felt briefly and uncomfortably as though they had been there, as though they had stood in the palace courtyard, and watched the water run over Pilate's hands. Berlioz recovered first, as educated men do, by reaching for a framework. He said, it is an interesting reconstruction, a novelist's version, not historically accurate, of course, but vivid. The foreigner looked at him. He said, I was there. Berlioz said, I beg your pardon. The foreigner said, I was there, on the balcony, with Pilate. I spoke to him before the prisoner was brought in. I had been having an interesting morning. He said this in the tone of a man describing a pleasant Tuesday. Homeless leaned forward. He was young enough to find this fascinating rather than alarming. He said, so you are claiming to have been present at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ? The foreigner said, I am not claiming anything. I am telling you what happened. There is a difference. He then produced his documents. At least, he reached into his jacket for them. He said he had been invited to Moscow by the government. He was a specialist, a consultant. He had business here. His name was Walland. Professor Walland. Berlioz examined the documents carefully and found them to be entirely in order, though issued in a country he couldn't quite identify, and stamped with an official seal he didn't recognize. He handed them back. The foreigner put them away, and said, I want to ask you something. Since neither of you believes in God or the devil, or the afterlife, tell me, what do you believe controls the life of a man? Berlioz said, man himself controls his own life. The foreigner said, but how? A man makes his plans. He arranges his future. He knows where he will be this evening, and next week and next year. But does he truly control these things? He paused. He said, take yourself for instance. What are your plans for this evening? Berlioz said, I have a meeting. Then I'm going home. The foreigner nodded. He said, and tomorrow? Berlioz said, tomorrow I have work. Various things. The foreigner said, I see. And you are quite certain that all of this will happen, that your plans will unfold as you have described? Berlioz said, I see no reason why they should not. The foreigner looked at him, for a moment with the expression of a man who knows something the other person does not, and is deciding whether to say it. He said, the difficulty is that human beings, when they make their plans, leave out one important variable. They plan as though they are immortal, as though the future is guaranteed. But the future, as it turns out, is less guaranteed than any of us would like to believe. He paused again. He said, Anishka has already bought the sunflower oil, and not only bought it, but spilled it too. So the meeting will not take place. Berlioz stared at him. Homeless said, what does sunflower oil have to do with anything? The foreigner smiled. He said, you will see. He stood, nodded to both of them with great courtesy, and walked away down the path, his walking stick tapping on the stones, his gray suit perfectly pressed, his two mismatched eyes, one green, one black, catching the last of the evening light. Berlioz watched him go. Then he stood, excused himself from Homeless, and walked toward the tram stop. He needed to make a phone call. He needed to report the foreigner to the appropriate authorities. He was certain of this. He was also certain of his meeting of his evening, of his tomorrow. He was not certain about the sunflower oil. He was thinking about the sunflower oil when he stepped onto the tram tracks. He was still thinking about it when the tram came. The foreigner's prediction was correct in every particular. The tram driver was a woman. She was a member of the Komsomol. The oil that Anishka had spilled that morning gleamed on the stones of the tracks, invisible in the evening light. Berlioz slipped. And the greatest literary editor in Moscow, the man who had commissioned a poem arguing that Jesus Christ had never existed, the man who had been absolutely certain of his evening, his tomorrow, his plans, departed the world with exactly as much warning as the foreigner had given him, which was to say, he had been warned completely and had not believed it, and it had happened anyway. This is, Bulgakov suggests, the human condition. Chapter Transition. You have reached the end of Part 1, Chapters 1 through 3 of The Master and Margarita, by Mikhail Bulgakov. In the next episode, the poet homeless, having witnessed something impossible at Patriarch's ponds, sets off across Moscow in pursuit of the foreigner, and discovers that Moscow is a very strange place, once you start looking at it carefully. Meanwhile, the devil and his retinue settle into an apartment on Sadova Street that has an odd reputation. People who live there tend to disappear. The next episode is available next week. Subscribe to Around the World Lit Audio so you never miss a chapter. A new episode arrives every week.